right, well, we're going to actually finish up our question and answer thing tonight. Go back to a question I've already replied to some already. How do you raise boys to be men and girls to be ladies? How do you train boys to be confident leaders? At what point does a boy become a man? I didn't think the answer to that. What are the defining characteristics of a well-rounded, godly man? Well, one of the things that you could do 2 weeks of series on this question, but been preaching some there that deals with these things in Titus chapter 2. This is what churches should be producing by the time that, if they've had somebody that's at least come up in the church, by the time they're adult. Same thing for the ladies. Doctrine fitted to men, doctrine fitted to women. And again, all the stuff that we have now, I never heard any. I would have never thought anybody would think such ridiculous stuff as they think now. And certainly the patterns in the home, at least to the people I knew and a lot of people that I went to school with, this was really what the Bible established was a pretty general guideline that people followed. And of course, I went to public school, and there wasn't any. They didn't allow any profanity. Certainly not the teachers say anything like that, using that kind of language. A student never dared to attack a teacher or even backtalk a teacher. I know I probably mentioned from the pulpit, I talked about it. Time a guy kind of complained at the blackboard about the math problem he's supposed to be doing. The teacher grabbed him by the hair. They didn't put up with a lot of the stuff. And she didn't get sued or fired or anything, Parents didn't complain about it. So, for us, paddling a disobedient student was a common occurrence. And I think I may have mentioned recently, but I got one when I was in the 7th grade, and I forgot to throw my chewing gum out before I came into class. So that was worthy of paddling. So they did maintain obedience, order in the classrooms, and some of the teachers I had in public school, as soon as they opened Alamance Christian School, they went and taught there. So the general idea of what an upstanding man or woman was still heavily influenced by Christianity. Of course, that's no longer the case, although I am encouraged by things we're seeing now. And one of the worst things, the greatest contributors to the situation we have, is the people don't understand the absolute necessity of physical discipline that the Bible requires in rearing children. And I think you can use some different methods, but when you start substituting time out for a spanking, eventually you're going to have a problem, because that is specifically what the Bible commands us to do. One of the real influences early, back when around the age I was growing up, was a book titled Baby and Child Care. It's written by a psychologist named, they called him Dr. Spock, Benjamin Spock. He was both a pediatrician and, it's kind of like today, he was a left-wing political activist. But he wrote that book in 1940, and 15 million Americans bought a copy. He died in 1998. But anyway, in the liberal church that I grew up in, they didn't preach salvation. Basically, good works was how you got to heaven. In spite of that, I never saw a child disrupt a service. Never saw a child run in the church hallway or anything like that. Everybody sat quietly. And I graduated from high school in 1975, so I guess that's been a while. But, now we've got all these people, children that, and adults, transgenders, and you've got kids shooting people in schools or in churches, and you cannot trust your child to the teachers who are supposed to be, educate them and so forth. And so I want to emphasize one simple, important truth, and that it's my belief that you can't start too soon training your children. We used to, when Kathy would be expecting, we would pray over the child. I don't know if I assume they have some awareness of what's going on outside their environment. But the Bible certainly refers to how early, like in Luke 1, verse 80, talking about John the Baptist, says, the child grew and waxed strong in spirit, and was in the deserts till the day of his showing unto Israel. So he got started early. In chapter 2, is talking about Jesus with his parents. Verse 39 to 42 says that when they had performed all things according to the law of the Lord. So that would be when on the second day of his life, the male babies were circumcised, so they were presented in the temple then. But they returned to Galilee, to their own city Nazareth, and the child grew and waxed strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem at the custom of the feast. So there were people, the males had to make 3 yearly journeys at least to Jerusalem for the feast. And, Mary and Joseph certainly were obeying that. They were setting a pattern. It says later in Jesus' life that he went into the Sabbath as his custom was. So he had grown up with parents who were in the synagogue every Sabbath. And it's an interesting thing when you start thinking about some of the characters in our Bible, particularly like Moses, who they were supposed to kill their male babies, and they hid Moses. And of course, Pharaoh's daughter found him in the water there where they built, they waterproofed some kind of basket. And of course, Moses' older sister was there watching, and she was able to say, do you need somebody to nurse this child? And so she took her, they worked it out where Moses' mother did. And, it doesn't say anything about his contact with his parents anymore. But after he was weaned, and I don't know what age they did that. But he lived with Pharaoh in Pharaoh's house. But he must have learned quite a bit from his parents before he went to live with them, because, at 40 years old, or somewhere around in there, he defended an Israelite. It was one of his people. And so he already had a definite idea, even though he was being, as Acts says, he was being trained in the wisdom of the Egyptians. He was being trained to be a military leader and that type of thing. Learn their language, learn their culture and all that. Certainly if you were in the Pharaoh's house, you lived like an Egyptian. But the experience of growing up in the home of godly parents is extremely important. And I know I've shared this, but had a fellow in our church years ago that said, you can't spoil them before they're 5 years old, and that's a lie of the devil. There's so much that needs to be done before they reach that age. And you should never underestimate how much a child learns in those first 5 years. They're hearing prayer. They hear the tone of voices as parents communicate in the home. They see the expression of love. They learn or don't learn the sternness of reproof, respect to parents. Do they learn to control their anger? Actually, that's the first time that I disciplined one of our children. I was changing Jacqueline on the bed, and I don't know what she got mad at when you're just a baby, but she stiffened up like that, so I just thunked her right on the padded part, and that was a surprise. But it's time for her to realize that's not proper for her to respond that way. I mean, if my dog knows what I'm telling him, certainly a child with a soul can learn those things. Hebrews, talking about Moses, Hebrews says that he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He made up his mind that he was going to live for the Lord. So your children are hearing all these things. They have the impression of the Holy Spirit around them if they're in a godly home, if parents are filled with the Spirit. Every home has arguments between the parents. I never knew my parents argued. But if they do argue, a child is going to see how they treat each other. A child will know whether or not his mom or dad has ever asked the child to forgive them, things like that. Whether they hear profane language, when they see their parents' attitude about spiritual matters. It's important to go to church, but it's just equally as important to see what kind of attitude there is about church, to be in a home where the Bible is read. So when you think about that, I know that David, according to what the Bible says, he was 30 when he became king. So there's a good probability that he was still a teenager when he killed Goliath. And I think about Daniel. I don't know how old he was. He was in school. And so I assume he was in his teens or maybe in his early 20s. And yet he convinced a man with authority over him that it would be a good thing to at least try it, to let Daniel eat this food that he had concerns about because of his religion. So he's dealing with an older man, and who knows how that guy could have been in his 50s or 60s or whatever, 40s. And here's a teenager who's away from his parents, and he had enough wisdom to talk with that older man about it and persuade him. So we've got all these decisions about rearing our children. We had a seminar on homeschool last year, and I'm not saying that every Christian family has to homeschool. You would think that up to a certain age, unless you had a really good Christian school, you would teach them at home. Psalm 127 says, "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain." Waketh but in vain. It's vain for you to rise up early, sit up late, eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. Lo, children are an heritage of the Lord. They don't belong to the government. They don't belong to the school system. They don't even belong to Christian school. They belong to their heritage, to the family from God. And the fruit of the womb is his reward. A lot of parents don't think that about their kids. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are the children of the youth. Now, if you got a guy that's a lifetime soldier, if he was making every arrow that he shot, arrow's got to be straight or it's not going to fly straight, and you got to put the feathers on there and so forth. And that's a highly skilled little thing you're doing there. But so is it to shape our children so that they're going to be doing the Lord's will and stand with their parents in the gate, that is where there's lawsuits or attacks or criticisms on the parents. So that definitely presents that's the way we need to be working with our children and guiding them and understanding how much time it takes that you have to put into a child. Does it matter whether or not you allow your children to pout or scream or tear up things or hit his or her mother? Or does it matter whether or not who they play with, their cousins, their neighbors? Are they just allowed to do whatever they want to do or whatever somebody who's with them does? Does it matter how a child dresses or how he or she sees his parents dressed or undressed? What about in the videos? One of the great impact is access to media. If you look at, I'm not saying it was a good influence then, but when you look at like the TV programs or whatever, whether it's children's programs or whatever, just an indication. When I was a kid growing up, when you had the black and white terrible picture equipment, you had TV shows like Father Knows Best, and so there were quite a bit different in what they are presenting, but still, how much time can you allow your child to have their attention focused on somebody that's in the world paying attention? Does it matter how they treat old people? Does it matter what kind of manners they have at the table? Well, I know this in 1 Kings 10, when the Queen of Sheba came to see Solomon, what did she note? Well, she noted their manners, the way they dressed, the way they stood, the way they sat, the way they set the table. You say, well, we're just sitting down to eat when we eat at the table. Well, I'll tell you what, one of the most important times and places of instruction is at the dinner table and at the breakfast table. When you have prayer together, when you talk about what you've done during the day, did they get indigestion because of what the attitudes are and the conversations like at the table, or that's something they enjoy? I remember when we lived over here in Carborough, we had a missionary family come over to our house, and I thought they were going to tear down the house before they left. They had toys riding them up and down the hallway, banging in the walls and stuff. We never let our kids do that because they were supposed to be stewards with what we had in our home. I want us to look at this Ephesians 6:4 here, 6 verses 1 to 4. In chapter 5 now, remember he has just gone over the relationship between husband and wife, and says that relationship pictures the Lord and his church. And so in chapter 6, he says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and thy mother. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Now, that's probably the most important direct statement in the Scripture, in the New Testament, about child rearing. It tells the children to obey their parents, but at what age would they be expected to be reading that on their own and learning it? So, when Ephesians was sent to the church at Ephesus, Timothy got that letter from Paul. He didn't go put it in a copying machine and hand out copies to everybody. No, he read that from the pulpit and expounded it. And he expect the parents would be teaching their children, obey your parents in the Lord. Parents are teaching that. Honor thy father and thy mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, if you want to have a good life. And here's where the responsibility is placed. And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. I always think, well, the mother has the most time with a child. They're in the home. But it assigns a responsibility to the dad. He's going to set the atmosphere, the spiritual temperature, the manners, everything that goes on in the house. And so that's where the responsibility falls, first of all. So just to note some of this, he's already addressed the husbands and wives and their roles and their relationship to each other. And so he turns his attention to the destruction of these children at a home. And so the first point, in my thinking, would be if you're going to have boys become men and you're going to have girls become ladies, Christian women and so forth, then they need to see the right pattern in their home. And I've known many Christians who were adults, who are living for the Lord, but if they didn't have a Christian home growing up, there's a lot they don't know. I mean, that's just the way it is. I mean, you think if you got saved as an adult, when you learn that God expects you to give 1/10 of what you make, that's kind of like, what? And if you've never heard that before, and you've been spending all your money, that's like something you had to get adjusted to. Well, if you've never grown up in a home where you prayed at the meals, where you had family devotions, where you went to church not only once in a while on Sunday, but Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, revival meetings, all that, that is a total life change. And so the primary way, I mean, you want to have parents that are intentional about all this, but the primary way that a child learns in a Christian home is watching his mom and dad, seeing how they act, how they do everything, and what kind of, again, atmosphere there is in their home. So children see if their dad loves their mom, if he's a leader, if he's seeking to sanctify his wife, and like it says, like the Lord is trying to sanctify the church, the husband is supposed to be sanctifying his wife, so leading her and teaching her. That means he's got to have some spiritual maturity. And how he provides for his wife, these are all, he starts in verse 25, husband, love your wives even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. Now, do you think that the Lord is affectionate to his bride? Think if you grow up in a home that's supposed to be Christian, there's no affection between the mom and dad. There's no politeness. Do you ever see your dad do special things for your mom? You know, I think it would be rare if you grew up in a home and you never saw your mom cry. You know, life just happens, but what would your dad do in a situation like that? Would he rebuke her for being a female? Or would he help her? You know, how does your mom respond? How does the mom respond when she has a difference of opinion about what the family ought to do or whatever? How do they handle that? You know, if you don't grow up in a Christian home, you start reading the Bible, there's just a lot of it that doesn't make sense. But if you've seen all that in your home, that's the way you start developing boys to be Christian men and girls to be Christian women. When the wife submits to her husband as to the Lord, not only obeys and honors, but notice that word in chapter 5, verse 33. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. Well, that's quite a statement, but, you know, it's preceded by the fact that a husband, I mean, would your children know that you men really love your wife more than anybody else? Would that be demonstrated by how much time you spend with her and that kind of thing? When men do not cherish their wives and they don't lead them to holiness to be presented to the Lord, that definitely affects a child, affects what he thinks about life and so forth. So a child's a man, a little man, you know, that's what Eve said, I've gotten a man from the Lord. He should be learning early from his dad what it means to love a wife, to lead a home, to set a foundation of godliness and that kind of thing. We can stunt the growth of our children spiritually and produce rebellion in our daughters and sons, that kind of thing. You know, there's a guy that was an all-pro basketball player. He used to play for the Miami Heat. He was a guard. His son became a transgender. So here you see this guy that's a tremendous athlete, and you think, what in the world happened in that home? Well, that's the kind of home that produced that. Now, both parents, of course, had to be able to teach their children to obey the parents. Well, why? Because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's where children learn to fear the Lord, in their homes. So if you don't, and it says, why do we spank them? Why do they obey? Because it's right. It's so basic that God said because it's right. He didn't even have to defend that or explain it. And so parents, that's the way you build the most basic foundation of wisdom. Now, I had a next door neighbor, our next door neighbors where I was growing up. They had two girls. The oldest one was adopted, and I I don't know if that had something to do, I think it's their philosophy, if I understood correctly. They didn't believe in spanking. They went to they were members of the Baptist church downtown. And so living, just say, living next door to her it was unpleasant, because things had to go her way all the time. And if they didn't, she'd go tell her parents. So we went out to play. The parents were inside, but she had to include her parents in on everything. And later, when I was, I guess I was around 30, I met her again, or saw again, after having not seen her in, 10 years at least. And asked her, I saw her invited to church, or she showed up, I think, here at church for a homecoming or something. And I asked her if she was married, and I found out that she was married, had been married for 3 days or something like that. It was less than a week before they decided they couldn't stand to be around her anymore. And again, their parents, as I understand it, they did not believe in spanking. But Proverbs 13, verse 24 says this. Get it here. He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. Now, literally, the word betimes has something to do with daybreak. So when it starts getting light, that's time when you start spanking. Someday it'll happen like that. It'll start in the morning, and they won't learn the lesson all day long. You're just going to have to keep working on them. But the idea is early morning, or actually just being diligent about it. Stay at it. But the important thing about that, that if you read these studies and stuff, they say that the most balanced, at least they used to say this, I don't know what they say now, the most balanced children are those that grew up in a home with high discipline, but also high expression of affection. If you got all discipline, you got heavy discipline, and there's no real love, you have a warped kid. It might be worse if you got high love and no discipline. You got a perverted situation there, but both of them produce trouble. But we got to have high discipline, but also high love. My dad worked, he owned a business, but basically every day, if there were any problems, he had to take care of them. And basically every day he ate dinner with us. If we had a ball game or anything like that, he was there. We all took vacation together. And so I just knew that, I could count on my mom and my dad, and I knew that they loved each other. Kids need to talk to their parents. I had an article, it's probably 20 years ago now, from the Wall Street Journal. It's a front page article, I think, where somebody had written, an opinion piece. And one of the most important things that any family could do was to eat supper together, eat a meal together, and have conversation, and get to know each other a little bit. We've all got responsibilities and so forth, but spending time with your children, listening to them. When our kids were at Alamance, it's 30 miles basically one way. So what do you do when you're driving your kids to school 30 minutes? Think about what you're going to do at work, or do you talk with your children? When you're coming home from school, what happened today? Ask them about, have you got any girlfriends? Yeah. Whatever. You got to talk with them and know what's going on in their minds. They'll tell you about their teachers and their problems and stuff like that. But it's spending time with them and listening to them and showing them physical affection. Now, we didn't have a whole lot of that in my family. That's why it's really difficult for me to hug a guy. And probably some of you are like that as well, some of the men. But, yeah, we didn't. There's 3 boys, and our dad, we just didn't show physical affection to each other, but you ought to. And then teach them to work hard. We talked with Pastor Sutton quite a bit about that. And Spurgeon and I have talked a lot about this, but, if you don't make your children work till they think they can't work anymore, you're cheating them. If you go out in the garden and they're complaining about pulling weeds and you let them go over and sit down, you're hurting your child. The sons, of course, especially need to do hard physical labor. In Galatians chapter 6, in verses 4 and 5, it says, "Let every man prove his own work, and then shall he have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. For every man shall bear his own burden." Now, got some pictures of Spurgeon splitting wood, or trying to. At least he was carrying the wood around. We just go play basketball together over at the school. We played full court, just one-on-one. And I beat him all the time till he got a little older. But he couldn't quit if he was behind. And I guess a lot of people say I was warping him, abusing him or something like that. But he learned to be competitive and had a desire to win and stuff. And I guess the first time that I specifically spent time with Jacqueline as a girl, it was a disaster. I took her out to eat, just Dad and Jacqueline. She's, I don't know, probably 8 or something like that. And I was asking her all these questions, and after a while, she just burst out crying. She wanted to know what was wrong. She couldn't answer all these questions I was asking her. I was just trying to be, have some kind of conversation, but I was on the way, or I took her over to Durham to eat, just the 2 of us. But, things like that. Your girls need to learn to work hard. But guys need to be pushed physically. And I'm sure my grandmother Mitchell believed that girls need to be pushed as well. And all of them need to learn to do all the chores. There's some things that, outside that are kind of rough that maybe the girls wouldn't do. But guys need to learn to make their beds, put the sheets on them, wash the clothes. I'm not saying that's something they should do all the time, but they need to know how to do it. They need to learn to work on cars. There's some basic things that your girls need to know if they're going to drive a car. But, you make a difference in the type of labor they do. Your sons ought to get used to repairing things. And then, of course, you need to teach them proper conduct toward all people, but especially a gender, according to their gender. One of the sad things is if you see a girl and she's a teenager and she doesn't know how to stand or sit. It's a sad thing. If she sits down like a guy, It's pitiful. If she doesn't know how to stand up in front of people and, put her feet in the right place so that she looks poised and that kind of thing. You need to learn those things, to teach them, so they'll be confident, but they won't be braggarts. They'll just be fine young ladies who've been taught by their parents. If a guy goes out to eat, maybe he's getting his first job and he doesn't know which fork or spoon to use or whatever. And he takes a drink and he makes a big slurping noise. Depends on what kind of job he's trying to get. But, he needs to learn how to be a good example for the Lord. And so all these things need to be taught. Proper conduct toward adults. So one of the first things, particularly the boys, need to learn is how to shake somebody's hand. And to not be bashful, but you need to walk up to somebody, look them in the eye, grab them by the hand, give them a good firm handshake. And the girls, it's in our day, it's not a bad thing if a girl extends her hand, but she might stand there and wait till somebody extends their hand to her. That's the most proper thing to do. What about older people? How are they going to treat older people? In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 1 and 2, let's see, it says, "Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, the younger men as brethren, the elder women as mothers, the younger as sisters with all purity." Now, boys are the cruder gender, but they shouldn't be crude around women, females. Children should not be interrupting adults. They ought to be respectful to them. Mr. and Mrs. Yes, sir. No, sir. Things like that. Every dad ought to wrestle with his sons, but boys and girls don't wrestle together. Now, Spurgeon and I have talked about this, I think females today particularly need to learn some self-defense. I think probably the best thing is just a good figure squeeze, But if you don't understand that, somebody here can explain it to you. But still, there's nothing wrong with teaching them how to defend themselves. I would say when I was growing up, if you knew how to respond, if a girl had been taught by her mother and her dad what's proper, then typically they wouldn't have had trouble. But I don't know about today. You may have to know a little bit more. You need to guard privacy between your boys and your girls. Your sons need to learn to protect females. I remember an example of that. I remember in school, Georgia had some fellow in her class that kept pestering her and bothering and picking on her and all this. And so one morning, I think it was probably the first class or something, they were in the classroom together, and Spurgeon went to the door and called the guy out and asked him if he had been bothering his sister, Georgia. Well, I guess the guy had never been confronted about anything. But I think he got the shaky knee thing, and he didn't bother her anymore after that. Her older brother took care of it for her. And he didn't have to punch him or anything like that. But he was, I guess, at least a couple of years older. But that stopped all the problem that George was having, from that guy at school. But just the last thing I would say tonight is teach them to be servants. Again, there's a completely different attitude today among children that I observe from what there was when I was a kid. Everybody showed respect to adults. And you did say yes ma'am and no ma'am, and you didn't insert yourselves into the adults' conversation. You didn't, if you were at somebody else's house, you asked permission about things, didn't interrupt your parents. I guess, I don't know what everybody thinks about playing cards. My parents played once a month. They got together with some other friends and played bridge. They didn't gamble or anything like that. But it was a learning experience for me, because us boys had to set the table. We had to wait the table. We had to go around and ask them, these adults, they were there enjoying my parents' company. So we took their, asked them if they needed some more to drink. I learned all that stuff before I ever had to go out and, take a female out or be around people at a banquet or something like that. I already knew how to do all that stuff, how it was supposed to be done. I mean, if they had 3 forks at the plate, I didn't say, well, who set this table? They didn't even know you don't need but 1 fork. I knew what they were for. And so you learn to be a servant. They should know that Jesus said that he that will be greatest among you shall be your servant. They need to know that Jesus said to his disciples, he said, I am among you as he that serveth. Children are, these old things people used to say all the time, children will be seen, not heard. And they weren't supposed to be dominating the conversation or attracting all the attention. People came to our house, they were able to communicate with my parents because we weren't interrupting and causing all kind of havoc while they were there. And in 1 Corinthians 14, in verse 12, it says this, seek that you may excel to the edifying of the church. When you teach your kids about coming to church, what are they there for? They're to help edify. They're to learn, and as they get older, they're there for a reason. They're there to serve. 1 Corinthians 14:26 says this, let all things be done unto edifying. And there's so many opportunities. If they learn to play an instrument, they have musical ability, they can use that. They can clean up when we have dinners and stuff like that. They can help older folks going up and down stairs or things like that. It just depends on whether they're taught by their parents to be servants or to expect people to serve them. What a difference. And what a big difference it'll make in them as they become adults and try to live for the Lord. And the greatest way to teach all that, yes, we should have devotions in our home and all that. The best thing we know is parents who can set a right example of what a godly servant is. All right, gone a little longer than usual. Father, we thank you for your word. Give us, our parents, wisdom as they rear their children. Be careful and instructors and to set the example. And we pray, Lord, that in this ungodly time in our nation, that we would rear children who would impress for Christ's sake, just like Solomon's servants impressed the Queen of Sheba. I pray this in Jesus' name.